Iran just attacked American military positions. Drones, plural, struck a location in Iraq where US troops are stationed right now, today, in 2026. Fighter jets scrambled. Explosions lit up the sky. And what did you hear from Washington? What did you see breaking across the front pages of major American news networks? Almost nothing, a whisper, a footnote. Because apparently, in the current political climate, an attack on American soldiers isn't worth interrupting the usual programming. That is what we are going to talk about right now. Iran attacking US positions in Iraq, the Iranian Navy threatening American warships at sea, the collapse of Operation Freedom's Strait of Hormuz push, and the backroom deal with Saudi Arabia that nobody in power wants you to fully understand. This is not a drill. This is not speculation. This is happening on the ground as of May 7th, 2026, and the American people deserve to know every single detail. If you are new here and you care about what's actually happening in the world, not the sanitized, corporate-approved version, hit that subscribe button right now. It's free. It costs you nothing, and it means you won't miss the next time something this significant happens and the mainstream press decides to look the other way. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's get into it. Let's start with what actually happened in northern Iraq, because the footage is real, the explosions are real, and the men and women stationed at that base are real human beings in uniform serving this country. The area targeted is in the Erbil region, near Erbil, Iraq, which is one of the most strategically significant locations in the entire Middle Eastern theater. This is not some remote outpost that nobody cares about. This is a heavy US military stronghold. This is a place with a significant American troop presence. This is also where Kurdish forces operate, forces that the United States has worked alongside for decades, going back through multiple administrations, through multiple wars, through the fight against ISIS, through everything. These are allies. These are people who bled next to American soldiers. Drones came in, multiple drones. And based on the footage that surfaced, these were not small, insignificant devices. These were weapons designed to kill. You can hear them in the footage, that low, mechanical hum cutting through the air, and then the impact, the explosion, the flash, and then another one, and then another. Multiple direct strikes confirmed from the video evidence available, significant detonations, the kind of explosions that level structures and end lives. And the question that every single American who has a family member in uniform should be asking right now is this: was anyone hurt? Were any Americans killed or wounded? And why is the United States government not standing in front of a microphone right now telling us? Here is what makes this situation even more complicated and even more dangerous than it might appear on the surface. The US presence and the Kurdish presence in that area are essentially intertwined. They operate in close proximity. They share the same geographic space. So when a massive drone attack comes raining down on that region, the honest answer, and I'll give you the honest answer even when it's uncomfortable, is that we do not know with absolute certainty whether Iran was targeting the Americans specifically or the Kurds specifically. Maybe both. Maybe they didn't care about the distinction. Maybe the distinction doesn't exist in their targeting calculus. But here's what we do know for certain. Iran launched a large-scale drone assault on a location housing American military personnel. That is an act of war by any traditional definition. And the silence from Washington in response is not strategic patience. It is a failure of communication with the American public that borders on dereliction. Think about what we're actually talking about here. These are sons and daughters. These are husbands and wives. These are people who raised their right hand and swore an oath to this country, and they are stationed in a location that just got hammered by Iranian drones. The American people are not being given the full picture, and that needs to change. Now let's talk about what happened in the air over Iraq in the immediate aftermath of those strikes, because this is where the scale of this attack becomes undeniable. US fighter jets scrambled. That's confirmed. They went up to intercept incoming drones, Iranian drones, over Iraqi airspace. And at the same time, there were separate reports of significant jet activity over Baghdad itself, not just near the strike zone, over the capital, over Baghdad. That tells you something critical about the scope of what was unfolding. This wasn't a localized incident that was quickly contained. This was a wide-area engagement that had American military aviation assets responding across a significant geographic footprint. And here's the thing about scrambling fighter jets to intercept drones. It works to a degree. Our pilots are the best in the world. Our technology is extraordinary. But interceptions are not guaranteed, and the drones that got through clearly got through because we have footage of the impacts. So some were likely shot down, yes, but enough made it to their targets to cause confirmed explosions on the ground. That means Iran's attack achieved at least partial operational success. And in the language of military deterrence, partial success for your enemy is a failure for you. While all of this is unfolding, the US air bridge into the Middle East continues operating. C-5s and C-17s, massive military transport aircraft, are moving out of Europe and heading into the region, delivering supplies, equipment and personnel. So on one hand, the United States military is actively reinforcing its regional posture. On the other hand, the political leadership appears to be saying as little as possible about an active Iranian assault on American positions. That contradiction is not sustainable. You cannot keep sending troops and equipment into a theater while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge to the public that those troops are being actively targeted by a state adversary. That's not strategy, that's a cover-up of military reality, and the American people deserve better than that. We are supposed to be in a ceasefire. That is the official framing of where things stand. But let's look at the actual situation on the ground and ask the obvious question, who exactly is observing this ceasefire? Iran is launching drone strikes on US military installations. The Iranian Navy is threatening American warships. Mysterious explosions keep ripping through Iranian cities and facilities, and we'll get to those. The UAE was bombed. We fired a 20 cannon from an F-18 into an Iranian tanker just days ago to disable it after it ignored repeated warnings. At what point does the word ceasefire stop meaning anything at all? Because from where I'm sitting, what we have right now looks less like a ceasefire and more like a one-sided arrangement where Iran keeps shooting and the United States keeps calling it something other than war. The confrontation between the USS Frankie Peterson and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy in the Gulf of Oman deserves its own serious conversation, because what we are talking about here is a foreign military force ordering a US Navy warship to turn around and leave or face being fired upon. Let that land. An Iranian naval commander on open radio told an American destroyer to reverse course, head back to the Indian Ocean, and warned that failure to comply would result in being targeted. The audio is out there, broadcast by Iranian state television. And while, yes, we should always apply appropriate skepticism to Iranian state media, the audio itself and the response from the American ship are now part of the public record. The USS Frankie Peterson responded correctly. It identified itself as conducting transit passage in accordance with international law. That's the right answer. That's the legally correct answer. The Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding waters are governed by international maritime law, and a US Navy vessel has every right to conduct passage through those waters. But here is the question that should be keeping every defense analyst and every American lawmaker awake at night. What happens the next time an Iranian commander makes that threat and decides to follow through on it? Because they've been escalating, consistently, methodically. Each confrontation is a little more aggressive than the last. Each threat is delivered with a little more confidence. And at some point, that escalation ladder doesn't have a diplomatic off-ramp. The broader context here is the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically critical choke points on the planet. Roughly 20% of global oil flows through that narrow passage. Iran has been leveraging the threat of closing it as a negotiating chip, and now the Iranian president has made it explicit. Any conversation about reopening the Strait of Hormuz requires the United States to lift its naval blockade first. That is a demand the US appears unwilling and unable to meet right now, particularly after we just disabled an Iranian tanker with a naval aircraft. And so you have a full strategic standoff in one of the world's most economically vital waterways, with American destroyers being threatened by Iranian naval forces and the diplomatic pathway to resolution apparently blocked in both directions. This is the kind of situation that, if it were happening under different political circumstances, would be receiving wall-to-wall coverage. The fact that it is not tells you everything you need to know about media priorities in 2026. Now let's talk about Operation Freedom, the plan to force open the Strait of Hormuz, and why it was suddenly, dramatically, and confusingly paused by President Trump. Because this story is bigger than most people realize, and the details that have now emerged are genuinely stunning. When the pause was first announced, the official framing was optimistic. There was talk of an olive branch, of a potential deal, of diplomacy gaining traction. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't buying it. The timing felt off, the reasoning felt thin, and the subsequent events have not exactly validated the diplomatic optimism narrative. Here is what we now know, according to reporting from US officials. Operation Freedom, the mission to open the Strait of Hormuz by force if necessary, was suspended not because of diplomatic progress, but because Saudi Arabia pulled the plug. Saudi Arabia suspended the United States military's ability to use its bases and its airspace for the operation. Without Saudi basing and Saudi airspace access, Operation Freedom simply could not proceed in the way it was designed. You need those logistics. You need that geographic positioning. And when your key regional partner says no, you either escalate dramatically or you pause. The decision was to pause. But why did Saudi Arabia pull out? This is where it gets genuinely explosive. According to reporting, the United States allegedly communicated to Saudi Arabia that even if Iran bombed Saudi territory, even if Iranian drones or missiles struck Saudi cities, Saudi oil infrastructure, Saudi military assets, the United States would not strike Iran directly in response. Read that back. We told Saudi Arabia that if they got hit, we wouldn't hit back on their behalf. And Saudi Arabia's response was entirely logical. They said, in effect, why would we give you our bases, expose ourselves to Iranian retaliation, take on all of the risk of hosting your operation, and receive zero security guarantee in return? The UAE already got bombed. The US did not strike the Iranian mainland hard in response to that. Saudi Arabia looked at that precedent and made a rational calculation. We are being offered all of the exposure and none of the protection. That is a catastrophic failure of alliance management. It is the kind of strategic miscommunication or deliberate policy choice, depending on who you believe, that fractures coalitions and emboldens adversaries. If America's closest Gulf partners don't believe we will defend them when they take a hit, they will stop cooperating with American military operations. And when that cooperation disappears, so does American power projection in the region. This is not a hypothetical. It is playing out in real time, and the downstream consequences for US strategic positioning in the Middle East are going to be felt for years. Before we go further, I need you to do something right now. If you've made it this far in this video, you already know this channel is different. We don't do entertainment. We don't do outrage theater. We do the work. We bring you the facts, and we ask the questions that powerful people would rather you didn't hear. That takes an audience that's engaged, that's subscribed, that's showing up. So if you haven't already, subscribe right now. Leave a comment below telling me what you think about the US response to this attack, or more accurately, the lack of one. Should we be striking the Iranian mainland? Should diplomacy still be on the table? I want to hear from you. And share this video with someone who needs to see it, because information like this doesn't spread unless people like you make it spread. Now let's talk about the pattern. Because what's happening right now with Iran is not a series of isolated incidents. It is a deliberate, sustained campaign of escalation that has been building for months. And the American response has been characterized by a kind of strategic restraint that is starting to look less like wisdom and more like weakness. The UAE was bombed. That happened. Iranian-linked forces struck the United Arab Emirates, a US partner, a country with American personnel, a country that has made enormous investments in alignment with American regional interests. The US response was not a strike on Iranian soil. It was measured, it was calibrated, it was, in the eyes of Iran's military planners, insufficient. Then we struck an Iranian tanker with a 20 cannon from an F-18, a direct hit on an Iranian vessel. That's a significant escalation in one direction. But it was done to disable the ship, not to sink it. And it was done in response to the tanker ignoring warnings, meaning it was framed as an enforcement action, not a punitive strike. Then we have the mysterious explosions inside Iran, inside Tehran, inside Iranian cities and facilities. Are those CIA? Are those Mossad? Are those industrial accidents? Nobody with authority is saying, but they keep happening. Multiple unexplained blasts, ripping through Iranian infrastructure with no official acknowledgement from anyone. And now today, drones striking American military positions in Iraq, fighter jets in the air, the Iranian Navy threatening American warships. What does Iran read from all of this? What is the lesson that Iran's military and political leadership is drawing from the pattern of American responses? Because that lesson, whatever it is, determines what Iran does next. And if the lesson is that America will enforce certain limits, but will not escalate to direct strikes on Iranian territory, then Iran has a green light to keep pushing right up to the edge of those limits. Every time, without consequence. There are also those mysterious explosions inside Iran that keep getting mentioned and then immediately dropped from the conversation. Multiple blasts, unexplained. Happening before this conflict, during the active phase, and now continuing through what is being called a ceasefire, the range of possibilities is significant. Industrial accident is always on the list, but the frequency and distribution of these events strains that explanation. Intelligence operations, CIA, Mossad, or both remain plausible and historically precedented. Iran has faced covert sabotage operations targeting its nuclear and military infrastructure going back many years. Whether that's what's happening here is genuinely unknown from open-source information. What we do know is that something is happening inside Iran with enough regularity that it is no longer surprising when a new blast is reported, and that itself is remarkable. We have normalized unexplained explosions inside a country we are technically not at war with during a ceasefire that nobody seems to be actually observing, while Iranian forces continue to strike American positions and threaten American vessels. At some point, we have to stop treating each of these events as discrete, isolated news items and start understanding them as components of an ongoing, active conflict that the political establishment in Washington doesn't want to call by its real name. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If you describe what is actually happening, drones hitting US military bases, naval warships being threatened at gunpoint, coalition partners withdrawing cooperation, strategic operations being suspended due to alliance failures, if you describe all of that without the sanitizing language of diplomacy and ceasefire frameworks, what you're describing is a war, not a declared war, not a war with a formal beginning date and a clear set of combatants wearing different uniforms, but a war in the functional, operational, lethal sense of the word. And the American people have a right to know that's what this is. Let me ask you some hard questions, because this is the part where I stop reporting and start demanding accountability from the people in power who are making these decisions and from the media ecosystem that is failing to cover them adequately. If Iran had launched drone strikes on a US military base during a previous administration, pick any one, what would the coverage have looked like? What would the political response have looked like? We all know the answer. It would have been the only story on every network for days. Congressional hearings would have been called. Press conferences would have been demanded. There would have been a national conversation about what this means and what it requires. Where is that conversation right now? Where are the members of Congress demanding a full accounting of what happened in Erbil on May 7, 2026? Where is the Secretary of Defense standing in front of cameras, telling the families of service members stationed in that region what happened and what is being done to protect their loved ones? Where is the clear-eyed, honest assessment of whether this conflict, this ongoing multi-front confrontation with Iran, is being managed competently? Those questions are not partisan questions. They are not Republican questions or Democratic questions. They are American questions. And the fact that they are not being asked loudly and consistently by the institutions that are supposed to ask them, the press, the Congress, the public officials who swore oaths to the Constitution, is a failure of accountability that goes beyond any single political party or any single administration. It is a systemic failure of the entire information and accountability infrastructure that democratic governance depends on. The troops in Erbil right now deserve better than silence. The families who are watching the news and wondering if their person is okay deserve transparency, not managed messaging. The American public, which is paying for this military, which is providing the sons and daughters who serve in it, which will bear the long-term strategic and human consequences of whatever happens in that region, deserves to be treated like adults who can handle the truth. Here's what I believe, and I'm going to say it plainly. Restraint is not inherently cowardice, and aggression is not inherently strength. There are legitimate strategic arguments for calibrated responses, for maintaining escalation dominance without triggering a broader regional war, for keeping diplomatic channels open even when they feel futile. I can hear those arguments, I can give them their due weight, but those arguments only hold if the restraint is strategic, intentional, and communicated clearly to allies and adversaries alike. What we appear to have right now is restraint that has confused our allies. Saudi Arabia just pulled its basing access over uncertainty about American commitments and emboldened our adversaries, who keep striking American positions and threatening American ships without facing consequences that change their calculus. That's not strategy. And drift in a live military confrontation with a nuclear-aspiring regional power is extraordinarily dangerous. So here is where we are, as of May 7th, 2026. Iranian drones have struck US military positions in Iraq near Erbil, where American troops and Kurdish allies operate in close proximity. US fighter jets scrambled to intercept incoming drone threats over Iraqi airspace, with additional jet activity reported over Baghdad. Confirmed explosions on the ground, multiple direct hits captured on video. The USS Frankie Peterson was ordered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy to reverse course in the Gulf of Oman or face being fired upon. Iran has made opening the Strait of Hormuz conditional on lifting the US naval blockade, a condition the US appears unwilling to meet. Operation Freedom, the plan to force the strait open, was suspended after Saudi Arabia withdrew basing and airspace access, reportedly because the US declined to guarantee it would strike Iran directly if Saudi territory was attacked. Unexplained explosions continue to occur inside Iran, and the US air bridge into the Middle East continues, moving troops and equipment into a theater that is growing more volatile by the hour. This is the picture. This is the full picture, not the filtered version, not the diplomatic language version, not the version designed to avoid causing alarm, the actual picture. And it demands more than quiet management behind closed doors. It demands transparency, accountability, and honest leadership from the people who are supposed to be providing it. The men and women stationed in Erbil tonight went to sleep, if they slept at all, knowing that drones had hit their location today, knowing that jets had been scrambled, knowing that the world's most aggressive regional power had just demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to reach out and hit them where they live. They deserve a government that takes that seriously. They deserve a public that knows it happened. They deserve a media ecosystem that refuses to let it disappear into the news cycle. That's why this channel exists. That's why this video exists. Because somebody has to say it out loud, clearly, without flinching, without softening it, without turning it into entertainment. This is real, this matters, and you need to know. If this video gave you information you didn't have before, if it gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening in the world right now, then do me one favor before you leave. Subscribe. It's free, it takes 10 seconds, and it directly supports the ability to keep doing this work without compromise, without corporate pressure, without anybody telling us which stories are too inconvenient to cover. Hit the bell so you get notified when the next update drops. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think should happen next. Tell me if you think the US response has been adequate. Tell me if you think we're headed towards something bigger. Your voice in the comments is part of what drives this conversation forward. And share this with someone who needs to see it, because the only way truth competes with managed narratives is if people like you decide it's worth sharing. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you on the next one.